Coming up, that ridiculous interpretation of the 14th Amendment is but the latest evidence that we seem to have entered some sort of political equivalent of the Twilight Zone, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of unmitigated bullshit. Welcome to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with the latest evidence that Democrat leadership and Democratic members of Congress have lost any sense of or caring about what the framers intended for the impeachment power under the Constitution. President Trump has been impeached once again. Remember, an impeachment is the process. The House voted for the impeachment, including 10 Republicans voting in favor of it, but the trial occurs in the Senate. And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has already said that under Senate rules, the soonest the trial could commence is 1 hour after President Trump leaves office and incoming President Biden assumes the office of the presidency on January 20th. In other words, an impeachment trial to remove President Trump from office can't start until he's already left office. Now, there are some attorneys who are arguing that the impeachment trial can be conducted after Donald Trump leaves office, but that's ridiculous. The Constitution specifically sets out impeachment as the means to remove the president from office. It presupposes that the president is in office when the trial occurs. It doesn't talk about removing the former president, and in this respect, my explanation matches exactly with that of Alan Dershowitz, emeritus professor of law from Harvard Law School. He has bluntly asserted that this impeachment, quote, will not go to trial, close quote. But that didn't stop Democrats from the political theater of moving forward with impeachment in the House of Representatives. And that political theater of the absurd hasn't stopped there. Some in the media and in the Democratic Party, I know I'm being redundant on that point, are asserting that Senators Cruz and Hawley can and should be removed from the Senate under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Their crime? Speaking in favor of President Trump's position that the election was rife with fraud and that multiple swing states failed to comply with the Electors Clause of the Constitution by modifying the rules of the election through their governors, election officials, or state courts rather than through the state legislatures. They objected to certification of electors in specific states. Senator Cruz proposed a 10-day delay to create an electoral commission to look into the allegations of fraud before the Senate would then vote after expiration of the delay. If you're like me, you're wondering, what's the objection to what Cruz and Hawley did? The senators spoke on the floor of the Senate. They voiced their objections. They exercised their rights to free speech under the First Amendment. How on earth could what they said constitute an offense sufficient for removal from office under the 14th Amendment? What does the 14th Amendment say about removal from office? Well, the relevant section is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and it says, quote, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Close quote. So when was that adopted? Right after the Civil War. It was intended to prevent those who engaged in the insurrection of the South against the United States from becoming members of Congress. Now, if you're like me, you look at that and you think, what on earth are they saying about Senators Hawley and Cruz? Are they somehow under the mistaken impression That Senators Hawley and Cruz breached police barricades, smashed windows in the Capitol, and sat in Nancy Pelosi's chair? Are they somehow under the impression that Ted Cruz was illegally roaming the halls of the Capitol in a Viking headdress? No. The members of Congress and the media who are pushing the absurd notion that somehow Senators Cruz and Hawley committed insurrection against the United States and are therefore ineligible to be senators under the 14th Amendment are pushing that notion based simply on the senators' decision to speak out on the floor of the Senate against certification of the electors of specific states and Senator Cruz's push for a 10-day delay in certification so that what could best be described as an audit could be conducted. They literally are saying that speech by senators on the floor of the Senate expressing their concerns about the conduct of the election and proposing an audit of election results in specific states constituted an insurrection. That ridiculous interpretation of the 14th Amendment is but the latest evidence that we seem to have entered some sort of political equivalent of the Twilight Zone, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of unmitigated bull. Next topic. Political mean girls try to sweep the leg. If you've listened to multiple episodes of this podcast, you may have noticed that one of the things I like to do is make pop culture references to movies. And if you've followed even slightly the developments of the last couple of weeks, you know that there are plenty of movies to reference in connection with our current politics. The most obvious ones are quite serious, and perhaps the one most cited is the novel and movie 1984. But I'm going to make a couple of pop culture references that might strike you as not really applicable to the politics of the last couple of weeks. The first of those movies is the 2004 teen comedy Mean Girls, a comedy that some would argue was a virtual documentary about the levels of mental torture some high school girls can inflict on each other. It was also the source of quite a few additions to the pop culture vocabulary. So what on earth does that movie have to do with what we're facing now in our politics? Take a look at what's happening around the country. People who support Donald Trump, people who think he did a good job as president, people who agreed with his questioning of the results of the election in multiple swing states, people who agree with his policies, they're being singled out. They're being labeled as extremists. With no evidence, they're being labeled as white supremacists. They're being subjected in many instances to efforts to cancel them on social media, in their jobs, in their social groups. They're being subjected to a push to throw them out. Now think about the conduct of the group called the Plastics in Mean Girls. The lead character in the movie, played by Lindsay Lohan in perhaps her last major role before she descended into a nearly endless string of tabloid virtual breakdowns, was Katie Heron. She was being introduced to a high school environment after years of homeschooling in Africa. She initially made friends with some students who were outsiders who didn't quite fit in with the more prominent social groups in the school. When Katie made contact with the Plastics, the social powerhouse at the school, consisting of three overwhelmingly self-centered girls, led by the meanest of mean girls, Regina George, the expectation was that to be a member of the Plastics, Katie would have to abandon her less socially connected friends. Now, that part of the storyline is not exactly new. Think about how many times you've seen that depicted in film, the young boy or girl that must choose between the friends they grew up with and the new, more exclusive clique which they've been given an opportunity to join. Now take that dynamic and apply it to the politics of today. Who are the Plastics in American politics now? They're the Democrats and their network of well-connected supporters in media, Hollywood, academia, and much of the corporate world. They like to position themselves as outsiders, the defenders of the underdog, but the reality is they're in essence the Regina Georges and the rest of the Plastics, but reveling in their political positions and prominence rather than their looks, with their elevated voices in society looking down on those with the audacity to support the oh-so-uncool and decidedly not fetch Donald Trump. Think about the way that those on the left tend to view themselves now, and think about how they really should view themselves in terms of the characters in so many films depicting insiders and the outsiders over the years. Look at what they're doing on social media. Look at the attempts to silence those on the right. The left, Democrats, big tech, much of the news media, They're the Cobra Kai of the original Karate Kid movie. Not the recent remake where the roles are sort of switched, but rather the original, ironically from 1984. And as in the original, just as Cobra Kai and their sensei lost track of the moral underpinning and honor of the martial arts, the left, Democrats, big tech, much of the news media, they're the Cobra Kai of the original Karate Kid movie. Not the recent remake where the roles are sort of switched, but rather the original, ironically from 1984. And as in the original, just as Cobra Kai and their sensei lost track of the moral underpinning and honor of the martial arts, Democrat leadership, big tech, and much of the news media have lost track of the moral underpinning and honor of our country and our political system. The treatment of the social media website Parler by Amazon and the news media, and the characterization of Trump supporters by big tech and the news media and much of the Democrat Party is the political equivalent of a command to sweep the leg. And just as the audience understood the immorality of that command, I hold out hope that Americans will understand the immorality of the way Trump supporters are being characterized and treated now. In the end, I suspect you're going to need new laws to protect alternative political speech and beliefs. The crackdown on Parler should be seen for what it is, an incredibly aggressive attempt to prevent voices which conflict with those on the left side of the political spectrum from being heard, other than establishment conservative voices subject to artificial restrictions to keep them within an ideological box of conservative thought acceptable to the establishment left. The problem is we don't have the political strength currently to pass such new laws at the federal level. The solution in the interim is to pass them at the state level. It will take time, but if we can pass laws in multiple states designed to protect the rights of citizens and the social media companies that serve them to hold and express political beliefs regardless of whether those political beliefs conform to the views of the person in power at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue or in the halls of Congress, then employers will have to deal with those laws. Eventually, rather than trying to conform to a multitude of varying standards from state to state, as to individual employees, they may decide to recognize those rights nationwide. The more common that becomes, the more likely the citizens of our country will start to recognize that playing the role of the antagonist in a teen comedy or drama, whether playing the Plastics or Cobra Kai, and trying to convince your fellow citizens to abandon their friends because of their political beliefs, or force your fellow citizens to abandon their political beliefs, or supporting members of big tech destroying a company, in essence supporting them sweeping the leg, is a recipe for the destruction of what America was meant to be. The First Amendment was meant to make America the rhetorical equivalent of the martial arts ring. And any citizen, any competitor who wins the match of ideas deserves to succeed, and anyone and any company which seeks to win the match, not by rebutting those ideas but by preventing them from being expressed, should be viewed as the corporate equivalent of a martial arts team that has lost its moral compass and should be condemned. And the more Americans recognize that, the more our fellow citizens will recognize that we should all pray that we never experience the moment when there are no differences in political opinions, because that will be the moment we're living in a dictatorship. Next topic. When did little paper umbrellas become problematic? A couple of weeks ago, I took a break from my endless viewings of political YouTube videos and reading news and opinion articles online. As I've noted before, I get the vast majority of my news and opinion online rather than from watching cable news because I can consume so much more information by doing that. By going online, I can avoid the endless announcements of breaking news, followed by the same thing that was said 15 minutes before. When I took a break, I decided to go back and watch a YouTube channel that specializes in making cocktails, often with an explanation of the history of the cocktail, and sometimes an attempt to upgrade it, with the host experimenting with his own specialized version. This time the video was focused on Tiki drinks, and I was caught by surprise because the host went off on an extended apologetic explanation about the history of Tiki drinks. He seemed to be somewhat embarrassed to be talking about them or worried that he would be criticized for having done so. It caught me by surprise. I've enjoyed Tiki drinks for almost my entire adult life. When we finally started staying in an on-premises Disney hotel rather than the off-site ones, some of my fondest memories were laying on a lounge chair watching our kids go down the water slides while we sipped on various frozen or chilled concoctions of fruit juices and multiple types of rum. The only problem was that because it was a Disney hotel, to get those drinks to the octane I was looking for, I always had to pay for a floater, and by the time the bill came in, it would be so high it looked like I was ordering drinks at a strip bar. But in the end, it was worth it to just chill by the pool, watch our kids play, and talk with the other guests nearby, which was always a bit different from your typical local conversations because it always seemed like nearly half the guests were from the UK, so that would change things up a bit. And if I wasn't having one of those drinks at a Disney hotel, I might be having one on the Intracoastal in Fort Lauderdale or down in the Keys sitting at a waterfront bar watching a flats boat sprint across Florida Bay. So you can imagine my memories of tiki drinks are entirely positive. I was really caught off guard by the host's apologies for tiki drinks. And then I stumbled across what was perhaps the source of the sense that any apology was needed. And I stumbled across it in what is perhaps the best example in American society of something with a stellar reputation long past the time when it was deserved. I stumbled across an article in the New York Times entitled Reclaiming the Tiki Bar by Sammy Katz and Olivia McGiff. And to clue you into just how far down the woke gangplank this article marched, it's subtitled, Tiki Bars Are a Beverage Industry Mainstay with a Painful and Underexamined Past. Can the format be repaired? Good Lord, a painful and underexamined past? What on earth are they talking about? These are sweet, refreshing, whimsically named drinks best enjoyed in the sun at a beachfront bar or at a bar watching the boats bob in Florida Bay, or my personal favorite, next to a pool by a South Florida waterway while the grill heats up to cook the mahi-mahi or wahoo you just caught. The only thing painful about that would be if somebody in the party got seasick while you were cranking it in. So what on earth are they talking about? Well, they appear to be objecting in some way to the fact that tiki bars often try to recreate a tropical atmosphere when they're indoors. You don't really have to go too far to create a tropical atmosphere when you're in Key Largo, but if you're in a tiki bar in Manhattan or Chicago, that's something else altogether. The author notes that, quote, tiki bars can often reinforce the idea that Oceania is just a place to vacation, which belies America's history with the region. In 1961, when the Mai Kai, a tiki restaurant in Florida, sold 10,000 mystery drinks presented by half-dressed mystery girls, the U.S. military was using the Pacific Islands to test nuclear bombs. Fantasy was a far cry from reality. Close quote. Okay, now I get it. The author of this article cannot accept that people would have fun doing anything even slightly or arguably connected in any way to an area of the world where America did anything negative. I last confronted this when a social justice warrior author objected to the TV series SpongeBob SquarePants, in part because the fictitious setting for the cartoon was called Bikini Bottom. Yet the cartoon never acknowledged that the U.S. engaged in atomic bomb testing at the Bikini Atoll. Imagine whether you could ever be so devoid of a sense of humor that you couldn't understand that the fictitious setting for the cartoon was named Bikini Bottom because it's funny to name it after the bottom part of a swimsuit, not because the writer of the cartoon was trying to make a reference to an actual historical site. Perhaps the author of that diatribe about SpongeBob SquarePants would have found the cartoon more acceptable if in every episode that mentions the town named Bikini Bottom there was a 30-second aside for a historical perspective on atomic bomb testing. Well, that would go over well. In the middle of the scene where SpongeBob is telling Patrick about the best way to make a Krabby Patty, and before he heads over to visit with everybody's favorite undersea-dwelling squirrel, Sandy Cheeks, we can cut to images of mushroom clouds and evacuated islanders. Sounds like the perfect recipe for having hordes of preschoolers in need of psychological counseling. If you read the article, the one about tiki bars, that is, I have to admit it's hard to figure out exactly their problem with tiki bars and tiki drinks. It seems perhaps that their biggest problem with them is that they were invented by white guys, primarily some white guys in California in the 1930s. So what? If I go to a restaurant for sushi and it's really good, am I supposed to care whether the chef or the owner has a Japanese ancestry or a European ancestry? There's a great Japanese restaurant near me. Are they required to put photos on the wall of the Hiroshima bombing to satisfy these New York Times authors' objection to a failure to recognize the horrors of history? Is it problematic if they fail to do so? No, of course not. This article from the New York Times attacking tiki bars and tiki drinks is just the latest evidence that being woke is the opposite of having fun. Being woke is the opposite of enjoying life. Being woke is the opposite of having a functioning society where people get along. So in light of the latest ridiculous complaint from the New York Times, I'm going to end this podcast episode the way I began this podcast episode, but with a slight change. The left and the right should have a few Mai Tais or pina coladas or maybe even Singapore slings and talk. And I'll be back next week to continue the conversation with another episode of Political Spirits. Please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.